You are listening to the Bell Post.
Hi, and welcome to our next episode of our podcast on the Bell Post. And today we have a returning guest, and we have Eric Granof with us today. Eric, it's good to see you again.
Hey, it's good to see you, Ken. It's always great to be here.
How long have we known each other now?
15 years?
15 years. That's nothing. That's just a blink of the eye.
Man, I mean, and you look
Uh,
the same too. You have the same amount of hair, yet somehow mine keeps
yeah,
falling
no.
out.
Well, today we're going to be talking about a presentation you did that's called, or I guess would call it Bell Studies Truth versus Propaganda. But when we're kind of talking about that, we kind of start with the president's executive order on cashless bail, which was issued on August 25th, 2025. Talk about, how that, the issuance of that executive order, how that kind of created this issue for us to look at.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good starting point because, I'm still, my own personal jury is still kind of haven't decided if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, I think on the surface, yeah, it's great the fact that there's conversations at the highest level in the Oval Office being had about our business. Um, then on the other side of it, there's conversations at the highest level being had about our business. And what that typically does is, and what we've seen happen since Trump made the announcement, is that we've seen the spark kind of be reignited from the proponents of bail reform. I think there's so much hatred of Trump and what he's doing that I think anything he does has a greater opposite reaction. And I think we've seen that with this bail reform debate, where there's been studies, articles. I mean, it's like something breathed new life into these people because it seemed like for a while there, things were mellowing out a little bit. But they've definitely been reactivated in terms of their efforts against us due to Trump's announcement.
Well, when we talk about the president's executive order, I kind of want to look at it a different way. And that is, why is this issue one that the two opposite sides of the spectrum cannot agree to anything? I mean, this is one of those issues where it's kind of like criminal illegal aliens. One side of the debate can't even agree that there are criminal illegal aliens here in the country that need to be addressed. It's the same way on crime. We can't agree that that crime is increasing. We can't agree that it's that these bad bail reform policies are working or are not working. We would argue they're not working. We would argue they're clearly not working. And then now with all these studies that have come out that support the reason why the President Trump issued his executive order, and the Yolo County study, which he cited in his executive order, why can we not even agree from both sides as to that simple fact that crime is increasing and that the use of these simple release mechanisms uh, can put people in a worse position?
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy what's happening right now. I mean, we live in a world where there is no more debate. It's literally one side or the other, and the sides are so far apart that the only thing they have in common is this ability to argue. And whether Trump has been such a polarizing character that anything he says, you're going to get that opposite reaction in such a bigger way. I'm sure that plays into it someplace. If you had someone else in the Oval Office saying the same things Trump did, I don't think you'd have the same reaction. But it is interesting to me is because I look at the issue of criminal justice and specifically bail. There's a lot of common sense things that are really hard to argue with, right? If you eliminate police officers from a community, what do you think is going to happen? If you let people out of jail for free and you don't have accountability or anyone really watching them, and I'm not talking about a text reminder, I'm talking about someone responsible for that person's appearance, what's going to happen? And we're seeing exactly happen what common sense tells you is that A, crime's going to go up, and B, people aren't going to go to court. And we're seeing these things unfold in front of us. And yet the other side is producing studies that say there's no correlation or connection between the two. And so it's really bizarro right now, this world we're in, where there is something that should be so cut and dry that let's keep our community safe. Let's keep, criminals locked up. Let's make sure that we have some form of punishment so that you can prevent future crime. And then let's try to help the people that have issues that are helpable, that help them stop committing crimes in the first place. But all we can sit there and do is just disagree with each other. I mean, it really is just crazy.
Well, you mentioned defunding the police, and we've highlighted some studies on our podcast, about when you eliminate the police, what happens. And you can look in Seattle. I mean, we had the chop zone, and and we did two professors did a study about that, and we highlighted it on our podcast, and they showed how taking the police out of that area, which activists would say would make us safer. But the science says your crime rate is going to go up, and it's going to go up dramatically. In the chop zone, it went up like 75%, and the 2-block area around it, it went up substantially. And then in the whole precinct, it went up like 25%. And the problem is, by the lack of policing and the county pulling back or the city pulling back, they end up getting sued. And so they end up having to pay the businesses several million, but then someone was killed and his family sued, and the jury awarded them within the last couple of weeks $30 million. And so, but the activists would still say defunding the police would make us safer. And the science behind it says, no, crime will go up immediately and substantially. And yet we still don't have we don't have an ability to agree on these two issues. And I think the president's executive order highlights that, because, in your presentation, you highlighted a whole bunch of different articles immediately after the president doing that from all of the activist groups saying cash bail is effective and humane, but Trump wants to end it. The Bail Project responds and says, attacks the president's executive order. The Vera Institute says Trump's cashless bail executive order is dangerous. And then you've got cashless bail keeps families together. I mean, I would argue that simple release, breaks down families. It's the private industry bail that brings families together. Time. What is cashless bail, and what do Trump's executive orders do? MSNBC, Trump's attacks on cashless bail is a boon to a two-tier justice system. I mean, it's like they've fallen back on their original talking points against the cash bail system in response to the president's executive order. And I mean, on the opposite side, if you don't have Trump derangement syndrome, you're going, I mean, it looks like to me the president has looked at this issue, looked at these studies from Yolo County, and says, what these activist groups are doing in our inner city are bad, it's wrong, and it's putting defendants in a worse position. And so he's trying to address that. And I don't think he has any other motivation than that. And I would be called a heretic for saying that.
Yeah, I mean, but I think the ironic thing in all this is that all this stuff that's being done by the proponents of bail reform is being done to protect these communities. And what's happening is the complete opposite. These communities are being ravaged with crime. And then they come out with studies, and their studies say, oh, it's not that bad. And it's never like crime. We started letting people out of jail for free. We didn't make them pay for a bail bond, and crime disappeared. No, it's crime stayed the same, or maybe it just went up a little bit. But you know what? Dealing with a little more crime is still better than dealing with the injustice of putting people in cages. So they use this narrative, and they use their language, and they come out with a report that says something, some big finding. And then when you read the report, you find out that it really actually isn't a finding at all, is that nothing really changed. They don't really like data, and they like actually creating data that fits their narrative. So, for example, when they look at failure to appears, right? When someone doesn't show up for court, to us, that's a big deal, because when someone's on a secured bond, someone doesn't show up for court, bam, failure to appear is issued. You got to go find the person and bring them back in front of the judge. Well, they don't think it's that important when you miss a day at court. That's why a lot of times you'll see them start using the word willful, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, a court appearance is just like a dentist appointment, and I missed my dentist appointment, and I can reschedule it. So I should just be able to reschedule my court appearance. Well, that's not how it works, and that's not how it's supposed to work, and that's how it should never work that way. We're on the hook for all court appearances. And if someone doesn't show up, it's 100% failure to appear. If you go to 9 out of 10 of your court appearances, that's not a 90% appearance rate. That is a 100% failure to appear rate. The other side calculates by how many you go to. So they're saying they have a 90% appearance rate, but they missed a court date, and that's a failure to appear. So you're not comparing apples to apples, and they know that, but it makes their results sound a lot better than they are. And that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with organizations that position themselves in a legitimate fashion and have a lot of very big money behind it. And yet they're producing these studies that if you actually read the studies, they don't say what the big headlines say or the press release says. And it's a little worrisome is that policy is being driven by these studies. And I'm not sure anyone's even reading them. And I think we really need to, when you're talking about something like public safety, to truly understand the data of what works and what doesn't. And it's not happening.
One of the things that I looked at as a result of, your presentation is, we're hearing all this stuff about AI and, Abilene, Texas, just 4 hours away, they've opened up one of the first data centers in the United States for one of these AI facilities. And so, I just used this example of criminal justice reform, bail reform. And when you ask AI or artificial intelligence questions on criminal justice reform that we already know the answer to, because we want to see, is it true artificial intelligence? And it starts spitting back these pseudo studies, stuff that's just being issued by these activist groups. And we know we've done presentations or podcasts about, this network of groups that, Soros has set up where, one of the groups just all they do is issue pseudo studies saying, here's the studies that will support these soft on crime policies that you're going to implement. And then you have another group that's going to sell it to your public. Well, as a result of them flooding Google with these pseudo studies, you end up getting that being spit back as artificial intelligence when it's not. And so we've discovered that this artificial intelligence isn't true artificial intelligence. The reason why it takes so much electricity is it's a news aggregator. It's saving all the data on the internet and then it's pulling it all together. And so if you flood Google with fake studies or studies that don't say, they're just crap, then that's what Google artificial intelligence is going to spit back.
Well, it's interesting that you just bring that up because I just had a conversation with someone about this, and I'm actually doing a presentation at PBUS on Wednesday next week about this very topic. But it's very interesting. I almost feel like when I've asked AI a question, like if I use Grok or ChatGPT, or if I go and I use Claude, and I ask them a question about the Brennan Center report, or I ask them about bail reform or one of these studies. I'm actually finding that because it's aggregating and maybe it hasn't been around as long as Google or whatever, that it actually gives you a little bit of information from both sides better than if you were to just do a Google search, right? You do a Google search for any term that there is, okay? You're going to get 9 out of 10 results on the first page of Google, bad, negative press. And the other one that's not negative is more neutral, right? And then you got to go 3, 4, 5 pages in before you ever find an article that tells the other side. And so the question I have is, if Google's goal is to educate people and give people answers, right? Help them find things. Mm-hmm. They're not doing a good job of it because they're only showing people one side. People don't have the ability to have both sides of the argument to make an educated decision, because everything is negative on Google. And then I started thinking about that. Well, is the algorithm being fair, or is the algorithm not being fair? But then you have to think about Google's bias towards bail in the first place. I mean, we can't even do paid advertising with Google. So that shows you right off the bat, there is a little bias built into Google already. So is it that there's that much content out there by the other side, or is it a combination of that and Google bias that shows that we never show up when someone puts in a bail reform term?
But if you wanted to give them a better intent than that, you could also say Google's not an expert on bail, and how are they going to triage
Yes.
what's true and what's not true? So when the Brennan Center for Justice issues a report saying defunding the police will make us safer, but then we've got two professors from colleges issue a report saying crime will increase immediately, but that's behind a paywall because it's at a university. How does Google know the difference between the two? And I'm just saying at this point with AIA, you don't have to give them an evil intent to say it's at its infancy. They don't have the ability to triage at this point, not on the issue of bail and criminal justice reform.
Well, and Google's based on an algorithm. That algorithm has directions on how it's supposed to search and what's supposed to show up. So when you see only negative, you can tell right off the bat, they're not looking for objective viewpoints on either side. And then this new AI that Google's involved in their thing, you can even type in any bail reform term, and you'll see Google's own AI. It talks about it's spewing the narrative of the proponents of bail reform by saying, oh, you're locking people in cages. Oh, it's discriminatory. Oh, people are losing their ability to support their family because they're locked away in jail. And oh, it's a two-tier justice system. It's the same stuff we hear all the time being spewed by their algorithm and their AI. And you're like, well, where's the objectivity? Where's the ability for me to make a conscious decision on my own?
But when the measurement of success is all the things you've said, and not once have we said public safety or crime rates, then I wonder whether our measurement of success is wrong. I mean, shouldn't our measurement of success be public safety and crime rates? I mean, I would argue that, and I would say that's why we have a whole bunch of studies that I call pseudo studies saying crime is not increasing. And we saw that running up to the presidential election all the way until the FBI statistics got updated showing crime was increasing.
Their favorite metric, Ken, is there's less people in jail. Okay, which has always been interesting to me, right? It's like, well, crime is down, but the jails are full. So we don't need to have people in jail because crime's down. So they let everyone out of jail. Now the jails are empty and crime goes up. And like everyone walks around like they can't put 1 and 2 together there. It's just, it's crazy. The metric for how safe a pretrial release program is should never be how many people are in the jail. Okay, it should be how many crimes are committed, how many people are showing up, how many victims get a chance at justice. It's mind-boggling how the number of people in jail is the most important thing to them when it has nothing to do with anything. And if you really wanted to empty the jails, just open up a door and let everybody out. That's the cheapest, fastest way to do it.
Well, I mean, we need to talk about some studies, so we need to move on. But I think that's a great point, and I want to underscore that by saying, look at California as a great example. Prop 47. Prop 47, they moved some felonies to misdemeanors, including theft under $950. Then you got DAs in urban areas saying we're not going to prosecute theft under $950 anymore. So suddenly shoplifting skyrockets. Stores can't sustain $25,000 a day of shoplifting. And as a result of that, you've got commercial properties nosediving in value, and businesses closing. And suddenly now they're like, what's going on? What's happening? Well, it's all because they can say, well, crime has gone down because we're no longer defining that as a crime, but the public knows crime has gone up and it's unsustainable. And yet, we're still hearing, oh, don't believe your eyes, but they're lying. Believe us, crime's not going up.
But I love the contradiction, right? So you have public defenders and all these groups and district attorneys, these rogue district attorneys supporting these programs, right? Supporting the decriminalization, supporting a $950 limit in California. And then they get all these cases with people committing crimes, and then they're not going to prosecute them. It's like, well, hold on. You said $950 wouldn't be a problem, but it is a problem. You're just choosing not. It's like you see crime explode because they raised that number, and which they supported, but their way of dealing with it isn't admitting they're wrong. they're just not going to prosecute those cases.
Well, and we also have to point out that it's not sustainable. The public rolled it back with Prop 32 or 34. I don't remember which one it was. But the problem is the legislature hasn't funded the rollback. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that was their backdoor way of keeping Prop 47 essentially still in place, even though it's against the will of the voters.
And what are the things they aren't funding? Drug courts, mental health help, all these programs that are designed to help these people and get them not to recidivate. Those are the things that they're not funding because they didn't get their way. I mean, it's almost unbelievable to think that it works that way. This is going to help people. People pass this thing overwhelmingly, and the government doesn't fund it because the wrong side of the aisle, the person with the wrong initial next to their name, pushed this thing forward and passed it.
Well, so you've highlighted several studies about in your presentation, and you talk about how when you look into the details of the study, it kind of contradicts what they're saying is their findings. And the first one you talked about, you've highlighted, is a 2024 study by the Brennan Center for Justice called "Bail Reform and Public Safety: as Evidence from 33 States." Talk about how did you select which studies to highlight?
Well, I mean, it wasn't that difficult because the second Trump came out and made his announcement about his executive order, this Brennan Center study was everywhere. They put it out there. They started talking about how this, and the weird thing is it was actually done before the announcement, but they repurposed it and resent it out, really basically saying there was no statistically difference in crime rates before bail reform and after bail reform. Once again, it's not that letting everyone out of jail because they're good people, we just need to give them a second chance, made crime go away. It stayed the same, which, by the way, these programs are not cheap, right? So they invest all this money for the same result, if not a little bit more, because they always use words like no statistically significant increase or not a meaningful increase. Well, to them, but when you look at the numbers are increasing. And in the Brennan Center, there's actually a chart they show that they talk about. The whole thing is saying crime went down, right? You look at the chart and you can see, like, here's the point where bail reform starts, and here's the trajectory of crime before it started. Okay, so you can see crime was already going down before they implemented their program. And then you see it kind of go like this, and the rate of decline diminishes, and then it starts going up again. But their findings say there was no increase. But you look at the chart and it says it tells you a different story. But the whole report is filled with stuff like that.
Well, and none of the reports we're going to look at today said, did these bail reforms lower crime? All of the things that you've highlighted, their argument is, well, these reforms did not cause crime to increase. And they're not even disputing at this point that crime went up, which I think is a significant change, because for the 2 years before Trump was elected, you had all these studies that were being issued by these same groups. So they're still pseudo studies saying that crime is not increasing because of bail reform. And then they would say, you don't have to believe us. You can just look at the FBI statistics. The problem is, and then October before the election, the FBI statistics were updated, and they suddenly showed crime was increasing. And so suddenly they couldn't talk about crime anymore. And if you look at the timeline, that day is the day they just started yelling as loud as they could, Trump is a fascist, Trump is Hitler, because they couldn't talk about crime anymore.
Yeah, but they also use something they call language. It's all the language, right? They use crime rates, right? The crime rate stayed the same. Well, if you're letting out thousands and thousands and thousands of more people through these free release programs and your crime rate stays the same, your crime goes up, right? I mean,
well, I think that's a good point, because what they're really doing is they're using funny math to say, in support of our argument, crime is not increasing because it's still committed on the same percentage. We just have more people out of jail. And so as a result, more crime is being committed, but in their number, cooking the books, it's on a percentage basis. It's not on a gross number. So it's the same crime rate, basically. But when you look at it, it's more crime.
And more violent crime, because you got to remember, in conjunction with their policies, there's a whole criminalization effort. Okay, so crimes that were crimes maybe beforehand aren't really being counted as crimes when they're doing the comparison.
Yeah.
And you also have everything that's been going on. There's seasonality issues. There's law enforcement, basically being, defunded and all these things along the way. So it's like, it's never an apples to apples comparison, yet in some miraculous world, they're never able to drop crime rates. It's always just the same.
Well, and one of the other things I would highlight too, the same Brennan Center for Justice, they've been issuing, we've already highlighted studies for a couple of years before the election and saying crime is not increasing because of bail reform. Don't have to believe us. You can just look at the FBI statistics. Well, when the FBI statistics got updated, the very next week they issued a new report and said, well, the increase in crime is not because of bail reform. And you start to question their motivation because when they're saying you don't have to believe us, you can just look at the FBI statistics. Well, we did look at the FBI statistics. They got updated. And so now they contradict everything you've been saying for a couple of years. And so now they're like, okay, well, never mind. Don't look at the FBI statistics, just believe us. And, so when we look behind the numbers, the findings that they were highlighting in the Brennan Center for Justice study, it said these findings add to a growing body of literature showing that bail reform is an unlikely explanation for recent trends in crime, whether increases or decreases. That's interesting. They're hedging. They're really not technically admitting it, but if it is, it's an unlikely explanation. And they suggest that policymakers' recent focus on weakening bail reform as a response to crime has been misguided and a distraction from smarter and more promising ways to enforce public safety. But what do we find when we look behind the numbers? What do we find when we look at their reports in detail?
Well, I mean, first off, if you read these reports, they put disclaimers in their own report saying that all the information wasn't readily available. We looked at these 33 locations and jurisdictions, and all the information was different, right? So they had to manually manipulate the data to make it consistent in order to do comparisons. So anytime you're manually manipulating data, especially when you're as biased as these guys are, you can't trust it, okay? Second of all, they didn't look at everything. They only picked a number of charges. And then if someone had multiple charges, they didn't count that twice. So if anyone in the bail industry knows that when someone's arrested and you're bailing someone out, very, very often there's multiple charges on that person. And if you're only going to count one charge, you are severely undercounting the amount of crime that people are being accused of. So they do lots of little things like that where they manipulate the data, then they put it in the tiny, 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 tiny print in the report, expecting no one to read it. And then their headlines are big and bold with shining lights on them so that everyone sees that. And then they just run with that and no one actually reads the report.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And, because all they want is the splashy headline. And once the headline gets plastered all over the news, and that's what happens when the Brennan Center for Justice issues a report. Nobody highlights that this is a Soros-funded group. Then doesn't highlight who's providing what other activist groups are providing funding to them, and so, or that they're even citing other activist group studies. So they're kind of feeding off of each other, and so it's just. It's like a press release, and I've started calling the mainstream media, the Cartoon Network mainstream media is just parroting it back out because it didn't cost them anything to do that.
There was a concerted effort started years ago, and it was probably started with the Vera Institute to develop and dominate the narrative around bail reform, around bail online. Okay. So they got together all their groups, they got together all their activist agencies, all their supporters through these rogue DAs and everybody, everyone that has the same stream of funding that comes in. And something was coordinated where we're going to produce a study. When we produce a study, we're going to cite your study. Then you start our study and you cite their study and they start their, and you create a circular reference structure. And then everyone shares it online. Everyone comments online. Everyone goes ahead and distributes a really, really, really thick, bundle of paper with a big finding on the top to give it to a legislator and say, see, bail reform actually makes your community safer and it's a more fair system. And they're not going to read the report. They're just going to go ahead and slam that down when they're making their point to try to pass legislation. It is a coordinated effort. So when someone searches and wants information online, they Google it. And what do they find? They find all their research. They find all their articles because they've inundated the internet with their stuff. And meanwhile, we're out here saying, but we're right, but we have all the facts. And you know what? That doesn't matter in the world of perception. The perception is right now that you can let people out of jail with no accountability and they're just good people and they're not going to commit additional crime and they're going to show up and we're all going to live in a beautiful, perfect utopia where no crime is ever committed. And the problem is people are really believing that's possible. And it's getting to the point where you can literally have someone come up to you and steal your wallet, just the average guy on the street, and won't get that upset about it or say, well, maybe he needed it more than I did. I mean, we've turned this world into some crimes are okay, some aren't. Some people, it's okay for them to commit crime, some people not. And you can't do that. Your criminal justice system has to apply to everybody. It can't just apply to certain groups or certain designations of people. It doesn't work that way because now they've created complete and utter chaos in society and no one is safer.
I think those are great points. I kind of would state it a little bit different. I would say these reports, and this one specifically, flies in the face of common sense. You know, common sense is when you release more criminals, you're going to have more crime. When you have no accountability, you're going to have more crime. And that when you don't have consequences if people don't show up for court, then people won't show up for court. Now, the other opposite argument that we've heard that you've mentioned, you know, it seems like we heard those specifically during COVID, and those were proven not to be true. And if you don't have consequences, people will not come to court. And so here we are years later, still fighting those same battles. And it's, you know, when I really realized this was there was an article in the Dallas Morning News talking about a lawsuit from, you know, one of these activist groups. And they were talking about how they lost at the Court of Appeals. But they were saying to the reporter, and it was in the article, every trial court across the country that has listened to our arguments has found that the bail systems are unconstitutional. The private bail system is unconstitutional. But what they failed to report or tell the people was that every time the Court of Appeals has looked at this issue, they've reversed them. And so they're still making the same arguments every time, not disclosing that they lose them every time they get to the Court of Appeals, which is a violation of ethical duties for attorneys. And yet, and they're covering up the fact that they keep losing them. And that's kind of what these studies are doing too. They just keep making the same arguments, hoping that nobody points out that they're not true, or that they can paper over the truth.
Well, no one's going to ask the questions, Ken. That's the thing is their experiences. No one questions. When you're as passionate and righteous as these people are, how dare you question this? We're trying to keep people out of jail. People that are locked in cages, Ken, think about that. Think about the emotional reaction of people locked in cages. And the reality is, if you really step back and think about the narrative, nothing makes sense. There's only one way that their entire narrative makes sense, okay? And that is that every single policeman out there is racist, and every single policeman out there is purposefully going around and locking up innocent people. And that is not happening. It is not the truth. And that's why everything that they talk about fails. People aren't in jail because they can't afford a bail bond. People are in jail because they were found and accused of a crime. Okay? So that's a very different thing. Okay? No one is ever asking someone how much money you have in your wallet, and they say not a lot, and I'm arresting this guy and throwing him in jail. So they've created this narrative that tugs on heartstrings that is completely based on a false premise that is not true. And that's what they're trying to sell to the world. And that's why we see it failing, because it's not true. It's not based on reality. Okay? Police don't go around arresting innocent people all the time. Does it happen? Yes. But it's not their main purpose, and they act like it's the main purpose. Everyone in jail is innocent and being held because there's a racist cop that arrested them.
Well, I mean, just in reviewing the first study, I mean, we can line up two different distinct narratives. We've got like the Yolo County study that says in comparing two different people released on nonviolent offenses, someone on a private surety bond and one on simple release, the person that's released on simple release has a 200% greater chance of committing a new violent offense in the next 18 months. That's not coming from an activist group. That's not coming from any actor. That's coming from a DA's office looking at the data that he from his own data. And
Yeah.
you look at that and you go, I don't want any of my family ever released on simple release. And then you've got studies that we've highlighted about defunding the police, saying that if you defund the police or you get rid of the police, crime increases substantially. And yet we're still hearing from the activist groups that we need to defund the police and we'll be safer when we do that. You can't reconcile those two narratives.
No, you can't.
One is right and one is wrong.
But no one's questioning. And that's the problem is people just sit back and they just listen and they believe and they're too scared to question. They're almost being told not to question. This is the truth. You have to believe it. Don't question it because we know better. There's a Harvard logo on that study. We know better. So it's kind of scary that they operate in this way. I mean, it really is propaganda. If you think about it, is that they come out with these studies and they come out with a lot of them. So if there's that much out there, it must be true, right? And it comes from these sources, but little do people know you can give anybody money and you can get a study and they can slap their brand on it because they're getting paid. And then those go to the legislature and legislature's impressed because A, there's so much, B, there's a good logo on there. Next thing you know, that becomes proof for changing a criminal policy and now putting a community in complete and utter disaster.
Well, and the question becomes, how do you find the truth, among all the fake stuff? And then, one of the things that we haven't talked about, and I guess we hinted on it or we touched on it briefly, is the groups that are funding these studies. So, to talk about who is behind the Brennan Center for Justice.
Well, it's a lot of people, but they get money from the MacArthur Foundation, Safety and Justice Grants. All these groups are connected, right? You got Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation. You have the Vera Institute. You have all these groups. If you look at any one of these reports, and you mentioned it earlier, all the citations are the same. All the acknowledgments that they have in those things are the same. And if you look at the author on a report coming out of Harry Frank Guggenheim used to work at Vera. A report coming out of Brennan Center used to work at Harry Frank Guggenheim. There's all this intertwining and these connections between these things. And I give them credit. They've done a fantastic job in pushing their narrative into the cyber world. And that's really the only option for people to see right now. And until there's other options and other points of view, unfortunately, it's going to get harder for us. And I think, we need to be able to do the same thing that they do. We need to be able to put the truth out there in the same type of narrative that gets people to kind of take a step back and say, hey, hold on, there's this opinion and this opinion, which makes the most sense.
Yeah, but we wouldn't, our side of the argument wouldn't be doing the same thing they're doing. We're not concocting pseudo studies and blanketing the internet. We're actually highlighting what is good bail reform, what works, and just trying to get that to pull up as an alternative to all this stuff that we're highlighting. The next study that you highlighted in your presentation was from the Bail Project for 2025, and it's entitled "The False Promise of Bail: An Analysis of Pretrial Release Mechanisms in Court Appearance in Tulsa County, Oklahoma." Why did you select that study to highlight?
Well, I thought it was interesting because, once again, you get the Bail Project's another, objective, charitable bail organization that's doing a report on bail reform. This is an organization that goal is to eliminate bail. But what I liked about this report is that the numbers they came out with were just kind of absurd. Like literally, they showed the failure to appear appearance rates for people that were on a secured bond, people that have financial skin in the game, along with family members tied to that their appearance rates were less than someone you just let out for free with no accountability at all because you can just send them an easy text reminder and they're going to show up for every court appearance because they got a text reminder from you.
Well, and that's so contrary to what we know to the truth to be. I mean, the private industry has a failure to appear rate of less than 10%.
I mean, cash don't show up because of a text reminder. That's not why they're showing up for court.
But cash bonds have at least twice that, probably up to 50%. But when you do simple release, however you call it, whether it's cash, whether it's personal bonds in Texas, release on no bond in New York, or release on zero bail in California, those have humongous failure to appear rates, 60, 70, 80%. I mean, we've got stuff out of Cook County saying 75%. We've got stuff out of Harris County saying 75%, 80 to 86%.
Yep.
And I did a podcast with a DA from California saying that that's what they do for all misdemeanors, and that carries an 80% failure to appear rate on simple release. And when you that's a huge amount of data for this to just seem to be contradicting. I mean, it's not just close. It's not a little bit different. It is a huge difference. And it's specifically on appearance rates, because appearance rates matter, because courts can't go forward when somebody doesn't show up for court. We have to have them come back. And so this is going to the heart of the matter. If the appearance rates are the same, then why do we need the private industry?
Yeah, it just doesn't fly. Once again, you go through it, you look at who it's funded by. It's funded by something called like the Oklahoma Justice Fund, another, activism group that's, trying to eliminate bail and incarceration. But to me, one of the most important things that kind of came out of the study, once again, you go do the same thing you do with every study. You just have to read it. And when you read it, you begin to see the deficiencies. But what I love, and this is what these guys are notorious for, they always stick a chart in there to try to make a point about one thing, right? But if you look at the chart, you can begin to see a point about something else, right? So they have this chart in this report, and it shows all the different mechanisms of release that they looked at, like full cash, surety bond, release on PR bond, release through pretrial service program, whatever, like 5 or 6 different releases. And then at the very bottom of the chart, there's a line, and that line says how many days it took for people to bail out. Okay. Now, they don't highlight this line. They don't talk about this line. It's not mentioned anywhere in the report, but it just happens to be on this chart. And if you look at it, it's very eye-opening, right? Because if you go down to bail by a surety bond, okay, it takes 4 days, up to 4 days for someone to get out. Okay. And by the way, it's usually faster than that. Okay. If you look at how long it takes for someone to get out through the bail project and their process, it's 12 days. It takes 3 times longer to go out through the bail project than it does if you were just to get a surety bond. And we all know what happens when people sit in jail for too long. They lose their job, they lose their housing, they lose their family, they lose their ability to take care of their family. All these different things that they talk about, they are 3 times longer.
They're talking about them when they need to, and then ignoring it when it hurts them.
Exactly.
I mean, I thought the interesting thing is when you get to the limitations, on when you get inside the report. I mean, the report itself even says this really isn't an apple to apple comparison among subgroups. Well, what the frickin' frack does that mean? If that doesn't just disqualify the whole report? They're saying, it's there's limitations on what we did, and we were it's like we're guessing.
But you got to think about the timing too, right? So this comes out last year. It's in Tulsa, and what happens yesterday? ACLU puts a bill in there. They put 2 bills out there. One to create pretrial services and risk assessments, and the other to create bail schedules in Oklahoma. But where do you think a risk assessment bill comes from? It's because someone did this study and took this study and went to the legislature and said, we have a problem. See, you don't need to have all these bail bondsmen. We can go ahead and we can do this simply asking them 5, 6, 7, 8 questions, and we can be able to tell someone can show up for court, whether they're dangerous, whether they're going to commit another crime. These risk assessments are great. Let's go ahead and we can try to do that in Oklahoma. So there's always like a reason why this research is being done, and it's really to push their agenda through the legislature.
Well, that's a good point, because, I was like, why would they pick Oklahoma? And then I remember Oklahoma has a petition procedure for putting stuff on the ballots, and they've been pushing some left activist group items into that little procedure they have. And so then it starts to make sense that, it's not really a true study. It is something intended to push a narrative in preparation for the next legislative session.
Yep.
we don't think of things like that. I mean, when it's a study, it's reported as a study. It goes all over the news as a study. It's not reported as, hey, the motivation behind this is because, in a year the legislature is going to be here, and this is to set that up as an issue on their side of the debate. The next study that you highlighted is from, it's entitled "The Current State of Bail Reform in the United States: Results of Landscape Analysis of Bail Reform Across All 50 States." Is that the Harvard study?
Yeah, I think this is done. The Harvard Kennedy School did a study.
I mean, it seems like in reviewing that, the purpose of it was just to propose certain criteria for states to do in bail reform. It really wasn't a true study on anything. It's like, here's what I think your bail reform should include.
Yeah, but once again, they threw out in their findings, they talk about how it's difficult to draw conclusions that bail reform impacted crime, right? We can't say without certainty or with certainty that reforming a bail system, will lead to a specific outcome, such as a meaningful decrease in jail population is what they talk about. But once again, it's always no statistically significant difference, which means that it didn't really go up or down. It's just there was no real difference.
So we're asking you to spend a whole bunch more money and do all these things, and it's going to have no difference on the out fact. And by the way, we have not put this paper through any formal review.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. Of course, in the small print, it says, this is one of our professors. We never do a formal review. It hasn't been peer reviewed, but we're going to go ahead and put our logo on it so that it gives it credibility. So, and once again, if you read these things, it really, it's almost kind of disappointing that, you see Harvard, you'd expect there'd be something a little bit more reliable,
but you can't reconcile these two things from the report. Do these 6 things for any bail reform versus it is difficult to draw conclusions about general impacts of bail reform.
Yeah,
both things are in this report, and they're completely contradictory.
Yeah. But once again, they don't expect anyone to read it. They expect them to look at the logo and look at the summary. And then when you do that, you walk away thinking like, wow, they just solved the problem.
Oh yeah. But the problem is they're talking points. They're really not studies. They're just talking points.
When their opening sentence in a Harvard study says that bail is discriminatory and bail is bad and it creates a 2-tiered wealth-based system, that's not objective. That is the talking points.
Well, that's toxic. That's toxic language intended to cut off debate. And I would argue nobody likes the bail industry. There's a reason why, but there's a reason why it's been around 200 years.
Yeah.
And that is it does its job very well. And even more important, there is no alternative that gets anywhere close to it. And so if you want to have a successful criminal justice program, you've got to have a strong component of the private industry bail system. Anything else, if you limit or get rid of it, like a couple of states have, well, we know what the consequences are. Look at Illinois; you see what the consequences are. They have to discount crime to get people to plead guilty. So, that's what they're doing to keep their system from collapsing. Yeah. So the next study that you highlighted is bail reform causing an increase in crime from 2023 report by the HFG Foundation. Pretty right on point. That's the whole issue for the 2 years before Trump was elected. And that's one of the studies that was coming out before the FBI statistics were updated. Talk about that study.
But once again, they looked at various jurisdictions, right? So they took a look at like Harris County, Texas. They took a look at different places to see, based on the new policy, all the people they let out, what happened with crime. And once again, they used this rate language, right? The crime rate stayed the same. But okay, you had 14,000 additional releases in Harris County. 14,000 multiplied by the same crime rate. That's a hell of a lot of more crime that was committed in Harris County. So it's not real research when you do that. It's not a real finding when you say that crime stayed the same, the crime rate stayed the same. When if you look at the number of releases, multiply that by that crime rate, and you find out there's 500, 600, 700 additional crimes, and some of them violent crimes that would never have happened.
Well, and the problem I have with the Harris County model is, it was imposed by a court. It was a consent decree, only applies to misdemeanors. But then we've seen the activists take the Harris County model and take it to like Ohio and other states and argue with a straight face that it's the gold standard on bail reform that all states should follow. And the problem is the Texas legislature doesn't believe that the Harris County misdemeanor model is the gold standard. They've done everything they can to reject it. They've changed the law. They would say we don't want them to follow that, and they've made it where magistrate judges under Chapter 54 of the Government Code can't magistrate certain crimes anymore because they perceive that they're the problem in Harris County. And then you've got, so they won't even concede that there's debate about it.
Yeah.
They just ignore any criticism and then go somewhere else and say this is the gold standard.
But that alone, that should make you question. Anyone that doesn't want to have a discussion or debate or be able to defend their position, it's got to raise questions. And then once again, this HFG study does, the Harry Frank Guggenheim, is they play with that statistic again and then play with their language, right? What's their metric? If you read through it, it's the increase or decrease in releases, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, we implemented this policy and we increased the amount of people that were released pre-trial from 77% to 85% in Cook County, Illinois. It's like, okay, but is that a good thing or a bad thing? Like, yeah, you opened up the door and let more people out, but what happened? It's like, no, more people got out. More people weren't sitting in a cage. That's not the right metric.
We had a DA, a former DA from New York, on a podcast with us talking about this very issue. And he said that the politicians, when they were talking about bail reform at the legislature, they were saying, we're willing to put up with more crime to enact these policies. And I would argue that's exactly what they got. They wouldn't say it out in the public, but that's what they were saying in private, and that's what they've got. And now they've rolled back bail reform 3 times, and they're looking at doing it a 4th in this election. They're open to it, and it's because they got exactly what they asked for.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I go like going back in time, right? The federal government used to do a study. They did it for 15 something years. They did it every year. Okay, they looked at all the different mechanisms of release and they compared them. They compared failure to appears. They compared recidivism rates. It was the Bureau of Justice Statistics and the Department of Justice. They had a landmark study they did every year, in the top 75 most populated metropolitan counties. And every year the results were the same. Okay, and then they stopped. Why did they stop? Because Obama and Eric Holder came in there and said they didn't want that study done anymore. Mm-hmm. And the question y'all need to be asking is, why didn't they want that study anymore? And then why did Eric Holder feel it necessary to then issue a directive statement saying that this study could not be used to compare one mechanism versus another mechanism?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, he didn't say the data was wrong in the study. He just says you can't compare one to the other, which it doesn't make any sense, right? If the data is right and the data is the data, then you should be able to compare it. But they didn't like that narrative because it didn't fit from what they were going to do with the criminal justice system moving forward. And this is kind of where it all began. And we see everything now with if we want to go back to know what really works and what doesn't, look at the research that has always been done and had been done forever. And if you were to do that study today, I would tell you with absolute certainty, the results would be exactly the same.
Well, I mean, the thing I love about this study is, it's asking, is bail reform causing an increase in crime? And when you look at the final conclusions, it says, is it these additional releases causing more crime? Yes. But they just say, well, it's not a big increase.
And a little increase is okay compared to the pain and torture and the unfairness of keeping people locked up.
And
so they rationalize it, right? Is that we all have to suffer just a little bit to make sure these people don't.
But that shouldn't be the measurement. The measurement should be public safety, not releasing more people from jail. I mean, it should be public safety. And that's why it's ironic, because for the last couple of years, we've been saying, don't believe your lying eyes. It's just listening to us. And now they're saying, okay, your eyes weren't lying, but it wasn't a big difference. I mean, I would say from East Texas, that's horse hockey, but I mean, craziness. I mean, we're now in the period where those studies, when you look at the numbers, are saying, well, it's not us, or it's not going up, or these changes didn't increase it, but it didn't decrease it. That's the ultimate irony. They're sure not arguing that all of their reforms decrease crime, which is what the promise was. The
Yeah.
promise was these reforms would make us safer and would decrease crime. No one's arguing that it's decreased crime. They're just saying, oh, but it didn't increase it much. Well, let's talk about the S.J. Quinney College of Law study. Does bail reform increase crime? It's an empirical assessment of the implications of bail reform in Cook County, Illinois, which is kind of interesting because there's been additional information that's come out since that.
Yeah, I mean, Cook County, or basically Illinois, based on a study that was done because they did a little sample in Cook County, which is Chicago. And they found that when you release people for free, nothing, it's a more fair system, no crime didn't increase. And they came out with this report. And so these guys at the University of Utah said, well, hold on a second here. It doesn't pass the smell test. Let's go ahead and look ourselves. And so they went and looked at the report and they found a ton of deficiencies. And these people, they didn't look at the seasonality of data. So they were comparing, the high season in the before to the low season after, which is there's a natural already discrepancy between those two. Apparently there's a season for high crime and low crime. They played the rate game, right? The rate stayed the same in this report. Yeah. These guys point out, you release more people at the same rate, you're going to have more crimes. They also looked at, in terms of, there was a lot of programs that were in place, like crime prevention programs that got implemented afterwards that didn't happen before. So it was not an apples to apples comparison. And at the end of the day, these guys came back and said that the crime rate actually increased, I think it was as high as 45%. And meanwhile, the other report saying that it didn't increase at all. And violent crime increased 33%. So to sit there and say that here's a model that increased crime 45% and violent crime 33%. So what are we going to do now? We're going to get rid of secured bail and bail altogether in the state because we have a study that says it works. Meanwhile, no one looked to see if the study was flawed. And since then, implementation of it across all of the state of Illinois, and there is no more bail in Illinois. It is all free release or detention.
Well, and I mean, that's a great example of the whole bad bail reform movement. Here you've got two different looks at the same situation. And you've got one that is still not arguing that it's improved it. It just they're arguing it didn't make it worse. And then you've got another one saying it made it substantially worse. And there's no analysis, there's no backlash because of the discrepancy. There's no push to resolve the two discrepancies. There's no push to get to the truth. It's just one side ignores anything that
we're in a position, especially in a state like Illinois, there's no surety bail. So
well, there hasn't been for years.
So you and I really have no skin in the game for that fight. But when we sit there and watch it play out, we can say that it's not working. And
well, but we
want a business there. It's just not working.
But we have skin in the game when they're saying Illinois last year got rid of cash bail. Well, I mean, they didn't get rid of the private surety. They got rid of that 10 years before or 15 years before. Yeah. And that's how they got to where they are now. I mean, the cash bonds that they were getting rid of is people were posting either 10% directly to the court or the whole amount of the bond with the court. And the courts had set up a system where they were relying upon people's failures to appear as a part of their operating money. And so they needed people to fail to show up for them to get their money to operate. And so it was set up for failure, but they had already destroyed the system years before because their reliance on the private surety bail system had ended. And they were like, well, we're just taking out the middleman. Well, they weren't replacing us. I mean, the only state that's even tried to replace the private surety bail system with anything close would be the New Jersey plan. And it went bankrupt. I mean, they had to do a statewide tax increase to fund it, and they still ran out of money again. And that was one of the first states. And as a result of that, no state has proposed the New Jersey plan. They have proposed only simple release, no supervision, because that's the cheapest option. And then these activist groups come in and say, well, it won't increase crime. Yes, it does increase crime.
Yeah, it's interesting is that if you look at this comparison between, examining, say, the bail argument versus the socialism argument, right? It's like the promise of utopia in the bail argument is that everyone's released for free. Like we're all good. People are like crime is going to go down and all this. And what's the reality? The reality is if you go to a system that you release everyone for free or you detain only the dangerous, like the federal system, what happens? Your detention starts out really small and your detention gets higher and higher and higher. And in the federal system, it's almost 70 something percent now, right? Well, it started out in like the high teens, low 20s. Okay. And in a very short amount of time, in reality, it went. So what happens in this perfect world of utopia is not freedom, it's detention. Just like socialism, everything's free and everyone shares and all that. No, that doesn't help because you eventually run out of wealth and then everyone suffers together. So,
but I would even argue in social
of these things that don't ever come to fruition, and they're false promises that of systems that'll never work.
Well, I would even argue that with socialism, you start out with, okay, we're not going to hold anybody, but then you end up with, I mean, you don't ever get out. Yeah. It becomes very authoritarian.
That's a more harsher one, but the reality is it's a promise of utopia that never ends with utopia, and it ends up in more people locked up and more people in poverty.
Okay, so how, if I'm a member of the public, or better, I'm a member of the legislature, how do we differentiate between these pseudo studies that are just advocating for an advocate's position or an activist group position, and we find out the real science? I mean, how do we find the truth in all of the weeds?
I just think you have to keep forcing people to use common sense, because if you weigh common sense against a lot of the stuff that we're being said, it doesn't align. And I think you need to just question everything and read everything, because we can't rely on summaries and snippets anymore and headlines. We've got to read the details because it's always in the details, and these reports are big Broadway performances. These things are choreographed. These things are manipulated to make it look like the biggest thing. If I could describe this in a way that people would understand, it would be big hat, no cattle. And that's all these reports are, a lot of hot air with no substance.
I've been arguing for a while that, the bad bail reform movement won't last because it's just not sustainable. And is the president's executive order giving it a second second breath, or do you agree with me that it's still on the way out?
I think the jury's out still. I want to believe with all my heart that what the president did will have an impact. Mm-hmm. But as you and I know, bail is not regulated at the federal level. It's regulated at the local, state level and local level. So can he have an impact at the level he needs to have to end the debate overall? I hope so, but I don't think so. And for the fact that, like we talked about earlier, you have people that are so against this president that it doesn't really matter what he says, that will fight, even if he comes out with something right, they'll fight it just to fight it. I think with this argument around bail, cashless bail, they'll fight it even more, just because they were already fighting it. Now he said something, they're going to fight even harder. But I'd like to think that it meant something. And it's good to know that there's people that understand our issue at the highest levels that are advocating for, and it's not even advocating for what we do. They're advocating for common sense in the system. And that's what Trump's always been done. It's always been about common sense. Cashless bail is a bad idea because they're just not going to show up. And we can see around us what's happening. Crime is increasing and communities are less safe.
I agree with that 100%. And I think that when we look at these issues, one of the reasons why we've been highlighting studies on our podcast for a little bit, and I have another one to release in addition to our episode, is because someone has to highlight, what is the good information? What's the actual science on defunding the police? And so we're trying to help with getting the real data, the real studies out there. But I think it's going to be difficult to figure out what's true and what's not true. But I will tell you this, in the last legislative session in California, when the Yolo County study, there's multiple versions of it because it's been updated. When that was given to the legislature, they pretty much stopped bail reform, or the bad bail reform, from going forward in that session. So I think we have a big job to do, but once we do it, it has an impact.
Yeah, I think it, for the simple thing, it helps when the truth's on your side.
I've got to go, and I've got people calling me left and right, but I appreciate you being with us and giving us this highlight of your presentation. I think it's very important.
I appreciate it, Ken. I always enjoy it.
Thank you for listening, and come back for the next episode of the Bell Post.